You start off thinking it's love because it feels intense, unpredictable, and deeply consuming. One moment you feel close, the next you feel lost, and in that emotional roller coaster, you begin to believe the connection must mean something real. But what if the very thing you're calling love is actually the cycle that's slowly making you lose yourself? Welcome to Ghosting Psychology, where we break down the hidden emotional patterns behind why people pull away, go silent, and create confusion in relationships. Today's topic explores why intense connection can start to feel like anxiety instead of love, and how emotional inconsistency keeps people stuck in cycles of overthinking, self-doubt, and chasing. Why does it feel like the more effort you put in, the further they drift? You send the text, you wait, your mind starts filling in the silence. You reread what you wrote, wondering if it was too much or not enough. You check your phone again, still nothing, so you adjust your approach. You try softer words, then stronger ones. You show more care, more attention, more emotion. And instead of bringing them closer, it feels like they slip even further away. If you've ever been stuck in that cycle, there's a reason it feels so confusing. And once you see what's actually happening beneath the surface, you stop reacting the same way and start recognizing the pattern for what it really is. Right now, it feels personal, like rejection, like you're being ignored on purpose, like something about you isn't enough. And that emotional pain doesn't just sit quietly, it pushes you to act. You start thinking maybe distance will make them realize your value. Maybe one more explanation will fix the misunderstanding. Maybe if they fully see how much you care, they'll finally move closer. But every move coming from that place is usually powered by fear. Fear of being replaced, fear of losing connection, fear of not mattering anymore. And fear never moves calmly, it rushes. It pressures you into urgency. It convinces you that if you don't fix things immediately, you'll lose everything. So you try to secure things, you send longer messages, you ask for clarity, you push for answers, you reach harder. And here's the uncomfortable truth: most people only learn through experience. The tighter you try to hold on, the more distance you create. Not because your feelings are wrong, but because you're dealing with someone whose system doesn't respond to emotional pressure the way yours might. Some people don't move closer when intensity increases, they move back. When things feel emotionally heavy, they don't lean in, they step out. When connection deepens too fast, instead of feeling safe, they feel trapped. So what you interpret as effort, blocking, explaining, chasing, emotional intensity, lands on them as pressure. And pressure doesn't create closeness for them, it activates escape. So a loop begins, you reach out, they withdraw, you try again, they go quieter, you push harder, they disappear even more. And each cycle doesn't just affect the connection, it affects you. Slowly, you start turning inward. You question yourself. You replay everything you said. You start believing you're too much, too emotional, too intense, too attached. But that conclusion misses the real issue. It's not that you are too much. It's that you're trying to create emotional security with someone who processes closeness differently. You're expecting consistency and reassurance from someone who experiences emotional proximity as something overwhelming. For you, love probably means expression, communication, clarity, emotional presence. For them, closeness might register differently. It can feel intense, demanding, or even suffocating when it becomes too emotionally charged too quickly. So when you move closer trying to build connection, they may experience that as losing control of their emotional space. And control for them is often tied to safety. That's why they pull back. That's why responses slow down. That's why silence shows up where you expected reassurance. Not always because they don't care, but because closeness triggers something internally that they don't know how to stay with. The biggest mistake people make in this dynamic is interpreting distance as something they need to fix immediately. So instead of giving space, they try to close the gap faster. Instead of allowing silence, they increase contact. Instead of slowing down, they speed up. And ironically, that urgency becomes the very thing that deepens the distance. Because what you're reacting to as loss, they may be experiencing as pressure. This is where things become emotionally draining. Your attention starts revolving around their behavior, their replies, their silence, their tone shifts, their timing, and without realizing it, your emotional stability starts depending on their consistency. That's when attraction and self-control both start to weaken. Not because you're lacking value, but because your internal focus shifts outward. You're no longer grounded in yourself. You're waiting, monitoring, reacting. And people who are emotionally overwhelmed by closeness can sense that shift instantly. They feel the urgency, they feel the emotional demand, and instead of moving closer, they tend to create more distance to regain a sense of breathing room. At the same time, uncertainty makes everything worse. Silence is rarely just silence in your mind, it becomes interpretation. You start analyzing everything. Every message gets dissected, every delay becomes a signal, every small change becomes a question. And uncertainty is powerful like that. It doesn't give closure, so the mind fills the gap with stories, usually stories rooted in fear. This is how emotional attachment deepens, not always through connection, but through unresolved ambiguity. You're not just missing them, you're trying to solve them. But clarity cannot be forced from someone who avoids emotional intensity. Even if they care, even if they think about you, even if they feel something, their way of handling emotional pressure may be to disconnect from it rather than sit inside it. So their behavior becomes inconsistent. They come close, then retreat. They open up, then shut down. They engage, then vanish. To you, it feels unpredictable. To them, it can feel like self-protection. Many people with this pattern learned early that depending on others is unsafe. Maybe emotional needs weren't met consistently. Maybe vulnerability wasn't welcomed. Maybe they had to become self-reliant too soon. Over time, their system adapts. Don't rely too much. Don't expose too much. Don't stay too emotionally open for long. So even when they do connect, another part of them stays alert for discomfort and pulls them back when things feel too close. That's what creates the hot and cold dynamic that leaves the other person emotionally exhausted. One side wants connection, the other side sees connection as something that risks overwhelm, and when fear is stronger than comfort, fear usually leads. This is also why over-proving yourself rarely changes anything, because emotional availability isn't created by receiving more love. It's created by someone's capacity to hold it. You can be deeply caring, consistent, patient, and still meet someone who cannot receive it in a stable way. At some point, many people realize something important. Effort without reciprocity doesn't build connection, it drains you. What starts as love slowly turns into waiting, then waiting turns into monitoring, then monitoring turns into emotional dependence. Your mood starts reacting to notifications, your peace becomes tied to someone else's unpredictability, and without noticing, your life shifts into reaction mode, centered around someone who isn't consistently meeting you where you are. That's where the real emotional damage happens, not in the distance itself, but in how much of yourself you start abandoning to manage it. One message can give you hope, one delay can ruin your entire mood, one cold reply can send you spiraling, and then one small sign of warmth pulls you right back in again. It can feel like love, like passion, like something intense and meaningful. But in reality, a lot of that experience isn't love at all. It's anxiety disguising itself as connection. Because real connection doesn't keep you in constant confusion. It doesn't make you feel like you have to earn basic attention or emotional presence. And it doesn't make you feel punished for simply wanting honesty or clarity. That's where your power starts coming back, when you stop romanticizing what is actually destabilizing you. If someone only feels available when there is distance, then your closeness isn't the problem. Their unprocessed fear is. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because once you understand it, you stop turning their behavior into a reflection of your worth. You stop telling yourself, I wasn't enough, and you start recognizing a different truth. They may not have been emotionally equipped for consistency in the first place. That one shift alone can protect your peace. The deepest damage in these situations rarely comes from someone leaving. It comes from what you begin believing about yourself while they are inconsistent. Slowly, almost invisibly, you start changing. You shrink your emotions to seem easier to handle. You second-guess your words. You hold back honesty so you don't push them away. You start filtering your personality just to keep access to someone who is unpredictable. And over time, you begin disappearing from yourself. Not all at once, but in small moments. A message you don't send, a feeling you swallow, I'm fine you don't mean. Eventually you wake up realizing you've been trying so hard to be chosen that you stopped showing up as yourself. And that should never be the cost of connection. You shouldn't have to become smaller to be loved. You shouldn't have to dilute your emotions just to keep someone close. Because if someone can only stay when you ask for nothing, feel less, and expect less, that isn't real partnership. That's emotional convenience. And you were never meant to live on that. But to see that clearly, you have to break the pattern of chasing. Because the moment you start treating someone's inconsistency like a puzzle you need to solve, you give away your center. Your mind becomes consumed with timing, wording, strategy, interpretation. You start managing their behavior instead of living your life. And all the while, your emotional world starts orbiting around someone who isn't even meeting you consistently. That cost is too high. What most people need in that moment isn't another message or another explanation. It's emotional discipline, the ability to stop feeding a cycle that keeps draining your peace. Because no amount of perfect wording will fix a pattern that is sustained by imbalance, and no emotional plea will create stability in someone who cannot hold it. Real change begins when you stop reacting in the same way you always have. Not by becoming cold, not by playing games, not by pretending you don't care, but by refusing to abandon yourself just because someone else has gone quiet. That is where control returns. Because strength in this situation isn't about getting them back. It's about not losing yourself while they drift. Most people misunderstand power here. They think it's saying the right thing, one final perfect message, one explanation that finally makes everything click. But that mindset keeps you trapped because it still places your emotional stability in their hands. Real strength is restraint. It's not sending the message when everything in you wants to. It's not chasing when silence triggers panic. It's staying grounded when your emotions are pulling you forward. That isn't detachment from feeling, it's self-respect in action. And at first it feels uncomfortable because your system is used to relief through reaction, texting, checking, reaching, fixing. But growth begins when you stop escaping discomfort through impulse. When you do that consistently, something shifts internally. Your nervous system settles, the urgency fades, the emotional spikes become less extreme, and slowly you stop making someone else's inconsistency the center of your internal world. And that changes your presence completely. Because predictable emotional chasing is what certain dynamics rely on. When that predictability disappears, when there's no emotional collapse, no overreaction, no desperate reach, it creates something different. Space. And in that space, reality becomes clearer. Not as a manipulation tactic, not as a game, but as clarity. You begin to see the pattern without being inside it. You notice who shows up and who disappears. You see what is consistent and what only appears in cycles. And instead of asking, how do I fix this? You start asking, is this even healthy for me? That question changes everything, because it shifts you out of pursuit and into self-protection. And once you stop trying to win someone's consistency, you start protecting your own. That's when your standards quietly rise. You no longer see confusion as something to endure. You no longer see distance as something you must earn your way out of. You no longer confuse emotional instability with depth. You begin to recognize something simpler. Peace feels different. And once you've experienced even a glimpse of internal stability, you stop tolerating what disrupts it. From there, the dynamic becomes clear. Either the person starts showing up with real consistency, effort, presence, intention, or they don't. And if they don't, you're no longer guessing, you're no longer waiting for potential, you're no longer filling in gaps with hope. You're seeing reality as it is. Not as something to fix, not as something to decode, just as information. And information gives you something emotion never can on its own, direction. Because at that point, your decisions are no longer based on fear of loss, they're based on respect for your own stability. And that is where everything shifts. Not into coldness, not into detachment from life, but into clarity. You stop chasing intensity and start choosing steadiness. You stop accepting inconsistency as normal, and slowly, without forcing anything, your life begins to reorganize around peace instead of uncertainty. And the most important shift of all is this: you no longer need someone's return to feel whole, because you've already returned to yourself. And from that place, everything you allow into your life stops being a reaction and starts becoming a choice. What keeps people stuck in this cycle is that it doesn't feel unhealthy while it's happening. It feels emotionally charged, even meaningful. The highs are high enough to feel like proof, and the lows are painful enough to feel like something needs to be fixed. That push and pull creates attachment, not stability. When someone is inconsistent, your nervous system doesn't settle into safety, it stays alert. So instead of calm connection, you get constant monitoring. You start tracking tone shifts, reply times, wording changes, even small patterns that you wouldn't normally care about. Your mind becomes focused on prediction instead of presence. That's why it becomes so consuming. You're not just interacting with the person. You're trying to stabilize uncertainty through your behavior. You change how you speak, how often you reach out, how emotional you are, all in an attempt to get it right and bring consistency back. But the problem is, inconsistency isn't usually caused by your approach. It's coming from the other person's internal capacity for closeness, emotional regulation, or readiness. So you end up in a situation where effort doesn't solve the issue, it intensifies your involvement in it. The more you try to correct it, the more emotionally invested you become in managing something that isn't fully in your control. This is also where self-blame quietly develops, because when things are unclear, the mind prefers an explanation that gives it control, even if it's painful. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I cared too fast. Maybe I need to be less intense. These thoughts feel like solutions, but they often lead to self-reduction rather than real clarity. You start editing your natural emotional expression just to prevent distance, which slowly disconnects you from your own needs. Meanwhile, the other person's pattern doesn't necessarily change in response to that. If someone leans avoidant or emotionally inconsistent, closeness itself can trigger withdrawal, not because you did something wrong, but because intimacy activates discomfort in them. So when you move closer to fix the disconnection, they may instinctively move away to regain emotional space. That creates the exact opposite effect of what you intended. This is what makes the dynamic so draining. Both people are reacting, but in opposite directions. One tries to restore connection through closeness, the other restores balance through distance, and neither approach resolves the underlying mismatch in emotional availability. Over time, this creates emotional dependency on signals instead of stability. A reply becomes relief, silence becomes distress, affection becomes temporary grounding, and because the cycle repeats, your brain starts treating those fluctuations as normal relationship rhythm, even though internally it's destabilizing you. The most subtle shift happens when your self-worth starts syncing with their behavior. If they're warm, you feel okay. If they're distant, you question yourself. That externalization of emotional state is what slowly weakens your internal grounding. You stop checking how you feel independently and start checking how they are behaving to decide how you should feel. Breaking that pattern isn't about forcing detachment or shutting down emotions. It's about recentering your attention back to what is actually consistent in your life and within yourself, because emotional stability can't exist in something that only feels real when it's available. When you step back from reacting immediately, something important starts to change. The urgency doesn't feel as automatic. The need to fix things right away begins to slow down. You start noticing the difference between genuine connection and emotional activation. One feels calm, even when it's imperfect. The other feels intense, but unstable. And that's usually where clarity starts to form. Not because the other person suddenly changes, but because your perception stops being driven by anxiety. You begin to see patterns instead of moments. You stop interpreting every interaction as a separate emotional event and start recognizing the overall consistency of the dynamic. At that point, your decisions become less about trying to maintain access and more about whether the experience actually supports your well-being. And that shift is important because it removes the illusion that love alone is enough to sustain emotional health. It's not. Compatibility and emotional availability matters just as much. Once you stop over-investing in inconsistency, you also start reclaiming energy that was previously tied up in waiting, analyzing, and hoping. That energy doesn't disappear, it returns to you, and with it comes a different kind of clarity. You start reconnecting with your own preferences, your own emotional baseline, your own sense of calm that doesn't depend on response times or mood shifts. That's usually the point where the pattern either dissolves or becomes very obvious. If someone can meet you in consistency, it becomes naturally visible without effort or confusion. If they can't, that becomes equally clear without you needing to chase proof. Either way, the confusion reduces, and what remains is reality rather than interpretation. What makes this dynamic so hard to break is that it doesn't feel like a problem from the inside. It feels like emotional significance. Your system reads the connection as important, so it tolerates a level of uncertainty that it normally wouldn't accept in calmer situations. That's why people can stay stuck in something that repeatedly hurts them without immediately recognizing it as misalignment. The brain is also wired to pay more attention to unpredictability than consistency. Stable things fade into the background, but unpredictable emotional feedback creates constant attention loops. You remember the warm moments more vividly because they feel like relief, and you feel the distance more intensely because it creates urgency. That contrast is what strengthens attachment even when stability is missing. Over time, your emotional system starts organizing itself around those fluctuations. Instead of feeling steady in yourself and adding someone into that stability, your stability begins to depend on their behavior. That's a major internal shift. You stop being anchored internally and start being anchored externally, so your mood becomes reactive. Your sense of self becomes slightly conditional. You feel okay when there is connection and unsteady when there isn't. This is also why overthinking becomes constant. When information situation is unclear, the mind tries to create meaning to reduce uncertainty. It fills gaps with interpretation. A delayed reply becomes a story, a short message becomes a signal, silence becomes a conclusion. The problem is not that you are thinking too much, it's that your brain is trying to regain control in an environment that keeps removing clarity. And in that state, emotional self-trust begins to weaken. You start doubting your instincts, you ignore early discomfort because you're hoping things will stabilize. You second-guess your interpretations because you don't want to misread the situation. Slowly, you start trusting the pattern more than your internal signals, even when your body is already reacting to the instability. At the same time, the push-pull nature of the connection creates intermittent reinforcement. That means the reward is inconsistent, which is actually what makes it more psychologically gripping. If someone is always available, your nervous system adapts and settles. But when warmth comes unpredictably, it becomes more emotionally activating. You start holding on to the possibility of the next good moment as a form of motivation to stay. This is also where people begin to overfunction emotionally. They take responsibility for the emotional climate of the relationship. They adjust their tone, their timing, their expression, trying to avoid triggering distance. But this creates a hidden imbalance where one person becomes hyper-attuned and the other remains inconsistent, and that imbalance reinforces the cycle instead of resolving it. The more you adapt to instability, the more your system normalizes it. What once felt confusing starts to feel familiar, and familiarity often gets mistaken for compatibility. But familiarity is not the same as emotional safety. One is repetition, the other is stability. They can feel similar in the moment, but they lead to very different long-term experiences. Another layer is that inconsistency creates a kind of internal negotiation. You begin trading peace for possibility. You tolerate discomfort because you're attached to the moments when things feel good. You start thinking in terms of potential instead of pattern. It can be good becomes more important than it is consistently good. That gap is where people stay stuck the longest. Breaking out of that requires a shift in where you place your attention. Instead of focusing on individual moments of warmth or distance, the focus has to move to the overall emotional environment. Not what happens sometimes, but what happens repeatedly. Because your nervous system responds to patterns, not isolated events. When you start stepping back from immediate reactions, you begin to notice something important. The intensity decreases, not because the situation changes instantly, but because your engagement with the cycle changes. The emotional spikes become less consuming. You still feel things, but you are no longer fully absorbed by every shift. That's where clarity slowly replaces confusion. You start seeing that emotional stability is not built through effort inside instability. It is built by recognizing whether stability is present at all. If it is not there, no amount of adjustment on your side can fully create it. As your attention shifts back towards yourself, something else starts returning as well. Emotional self-reference. You begin to notice how you feel without immediately filtering it through the other person's behavior. You reconnect with your own sense of ease, discomfort, clarity, or tension without needing external validation for it. That is a critical turning point because it restores internal authority. You are no longer outsourcing your emotional reality to someone else's availability. You start recognizing your own signals again instead of overriding them. From that place, decisions become simpler, not emotionally easier, but clearer. You stop asking how to make someone consistent and start asking whether the connection itself provides consistency. You stop interpreting distance as something to fix and start seeing it as information about compatibility. And once your decisions are guided by patterns instead of moments, the cycle loses its grip. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped confusing emotional activation with emotional security. What remains is a more grounded awareness. Connection should not require constant interpretation, self-adjustment, or emotional uncertainty to exist. When it does, it may feel intense, but it is not stable. And once your system recognizes that difference clearly, it becomes much harder to ignore what is actually happening in front of you. The core message of everything you've described comes down to this. Intensity is not the same as connection, and emotional highs mixed with confusion are not the same as love. When someone is inconsistent, it creates a cycle that feels meaningful in the moment, but unstable over time. The brain attaches to the highs, reacts to the lows, and starts mistaking emotional activation for emotional depth. That's what keeps people stuck, not a lack of awareness, but the pull of unpredictability that feels powerful even when it's draining. Inside that cycle, you gradually start losing your internal balance. Your mood begins to depend on someone else's availability. Your thoughts start circling around their behavior. Your sense of worth becomes tied to how they respond. Without realizing it, you begin adjusting yourself just to maintain access to something that never feels fully secure. But the turning point is understanding that none of this is a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of mismatch between someone seeking closeness and someone who cannot consistently hold it. The pain doesn't come from not being enough. It comes from trying to build stability in a dynamic that doesn't naturally provide it. Once you see the pattern clearly, something important changes. You stop romanticizing the inconsistency. You stop interpreting distance as something you need to fix. And you stop treating emotional confusion as a sign of deeper love. Instead, your focus returns to yourself, your peace, your clarity, your emotional stability. You start recognizing that real connection doesn't require constant decoding, emotional guessing, or self-reduction. It feels steady, even when it's imperfect. It doesn't pull you into anxiety loops. It doesn't make you abandon yourself to keep it. And from that understanding comes the most important shift of all. You stop chasing emotional uncertainty and start valuing emotional consistency. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understand that anything real shouldn't cost you your inner peace. If this helped you see things more clearly, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what we uncover next on Ghosting Psychology. And if this message hit home for you, comment the word clarity below. I want to know who truly understood the shift.